Over the last several class sessions, we have been using this text as a way of unpacking from a 30,000 foot perspective. That is the kind of a perspective that you would get looking out an airplane at an entire landscape. Just the general purpose, strengths and weaknesses of capitalist markets from a moral perspective. And we've looked at several examples to unpack those strengths and weaknesses. For instance, capitalist markets are really good at bringing efficiency to human behavior. They empower each one of us to make our own choices. You know what's best in your situation for you, given your information about your own life and your desires and your preferences. And capitalist markets empower you to make your choices by giving you the freedom to buy and sell or refuse to buy and sell as you please. Capitalist markets then are very efficient since everyone in them, ideally without external regulation or interference, is able to buy and sell in accordance with their own wishes. Capitalist markets are good then at solving social coordination problems where there are imbalances or asymmetries between the supply and demand side. So line standing problems being the classic example in chapter 1, an imbalance between the supply, which is limited, and the demand, which is much greater than the supply, hence the line. Capitalist markets can resolve this by giving people the freedom to pay, not to have to stand in line, so as to obtain the good more quickly. We also looked in chapter 2 at the way that capitalist markets can be used to alter people's motives. We're going to look at that again today, actually, but in a different context in chapter 4. And in particular, we looked at how capitalist markets can be used to unpack and change people's reasons for doing things. We looked at getting paid for good grades, or getting paid for taking your pills, or losing weight, or quitting smoking, or other kinds of health-related issues, and how capitalist markets, when people get paid for these things, their motives for doing them change. We looked at how capitalist markets can alter people's sense of moral rightness and wrongness. When you get a speeding ticket, you feel a sense of shame because it's a fine. But capitalist markets, which can toggle that ticket's price in accordance with your income, can actually alter that sense of shame so it comes to feel like a fee rather than a fine. And we looked at that recently as well. Finally, this last time we looked at how markets, capitalist markets, are very powerful, so powerful that they can displace other kinds of motives. We looked at gift giving. And I asked if people would rather for Christmas have cash or if they'd rather have a heartfelt gift selected by a relative. And it was about half and half. Okay, those who preferred cash liked the efficiency and the liberty that comes with that, the capitalist solution. They liked the ability to choose their own gift because they know what's best in their situation and what they like the most. Others preferred the relational connection that comes from a relative spending time choosing a heartfelt gift for them. Even though the relative doesn't know them as well as they know themselves, and often will get an inefficient gift that is a gift that's not precisely what they want. Still, many preferred the idea of someone signaling that relational connection by means of the gift giving, even though, of course, it's not the optimal solution from a capitalist perspective. We looked also, finally, at ways in which capitalist markets sometimes do not successfully motivate in ways that are more efficient than would otherwise be the case. We looked at the example of the town in Switzerland where a majority of the residents were willing to have the nuclear waste site built in their town. But when they were offered money, rather than just doing it out of a sense of civic duty, that number plummeted, and only about 1/4 were willing to have the nuclear waste site in their town when a cash transaction was involved, because they no longer felt it was a matter of civic duty. They felt that it was a matter of self-interest and monetary exchange. So capitalist markets then failed in that case. And similarly, they failed in the case of giving blood in blood donation circumstances where some donate blood for free and others give blood for money. Today we're going to look at Chapter 4, Markets in Life and Death. So if you would open there, please, and follow along. For a long time, companies have taken out insurance policies on their most valuable employees. This is especially true for the lives of CEOs and top executives, for whom it would be a significant cost to replace if and when they die. But buying insurance on the lives of rank-and-file workers is a new development that has been taking place in increasing numbers in recent years. The reason why is because companies are now trying to make money off of their own workers. For instance, here's this case at the beginning of the chapter. Michael Rice, who is 48, an assistant manager at a Walmart in New Hampshire, was helping a customer carry a television to her car when he had a heart attack and collapsed. He died a week later. An insurance policy on his life paid out about $300,000. But the money did not go to his wife and 2 children. It went to Walmart, which had purchased the policy on Rice's life and named itself as the beneficiary. Think with me for a minute about insurance, and in particular about life insurance. Probably most of us have never purchased a life insurance policy. Who are life insurance policies generally for? Who benefits from a life insurance policy if it is claimed? Someone other than the policyholder, yes. The dependents, the relatives, the loved ones, those who would not be able to have means without the breadwinner. Okay, that's the original purpose, at least, for life insurance. But actually, the operation of markets can alter people's motives dramatically and alter companies' motives and make it profitable if companies can run a statistical analysis and outguess their own employees on when their employees are going to die. They could perhaps make money off of their employees using things like life insurance policies. Or third parties, not companies, could perhaps make money as well in the context of a capitalist market system. So for example, let me read this on page 136. To talk about the ways that capitalist markets can skew and alter motives so that people are actually rooting for death instead of life. Sandel writes, we can examine these objections by considering another morally complicated use of life insurance called the viatical industry. Okay, it consists of a market in the life insurance policies of people who have been diagnosed with terminal illnesses. Suppose someone with a $100,000 life insurance policy is told by his doctor that he has only a year to live. And suppose he needs money now for medical care, or perhaps simply to live well in the short time he has remaining. An investor offers to buy the policy from the ailing person at a discount, maybe $50,000, and takes over the payment of the annual premiums. When the original policyholder dies, the investor collects $100,000. A couple more sentences. It seems like a good deal all around. The dying policyholder gains access to the cash he needs, and the investor turns a handsome profit, provided the person dies on schedule. But there's a risk. Although the viatical investment guarantees a certain payoff at death, the rate of return depends on how long the person lives, and so forth. Okay, the reason why this example is included in this text is to illustrate what Sandel thinks has been a theme throughout his exploration of the morals of capitalist markets. And that is that markets are very powerful forces, and they can displace normal motives in ways that skew or alter how humans think of each other and their relational connections to each other. Okay, so typically, most of us, if we're normal, root for people to live rather than for people to die. But if you buy a life insurance policy in this viaticals industry, you are actually rooting for someone to die and not to live. That's what capitalist markets can do. They can alter natural human sentiments, sentiments of affection or sentiments of concern, care and concern, empathy, and they can make them subject to the power of monetary gain. This is also illustrated later on in the chapter in this section that Sandel titles Death Pools. Okay, death pools is just an online gambling phenomenon. These days, the online gaming world is just exploding, mostly around the sports scene. We don't have it in Texas yet, I believe, but I think it's something that's almost certainly going to be coming here because the desire for revenue on the part of public officials in Texas will probably be too great. At any rate, though, you can gamble on not just sports in the online world, but lots of things. You can gamble on who you think will win an election. You can gamble on whether you think the president will get indicted. You can gamble on how soon you think somebody is going to die. Okay, and many websites, Sandel writes, offer versions of this game with names such as Goal Pool, that is Ghoul, Dead Pool, and Celebrity Death Pool. Okay, contestants submit a list of celebrities they think are likely to die by the year's end. Whoever makes the most correct calls wins the jackpot of $3,000 in this one website. Second place is $500. Third place is lower, presumably. There are thousands of participants a year. Okay, there's certainly nothing wrong with capitalist markets as such when products that are being bought and sold are non-objectionable. But a lot of people would object to these applications of capitalist markets because what is being bought and sold is predictions about someone's life. Not someone's life, mind you, but predictions about someone's life. And that feels to a lot of observers as though it's corrupting. Capitalist markets don't tend to make moral judgments about the product that is being bought and sold, with very few exceptions. They tend not to make moral judgments about such things. Rather, they make judgments on the basis of who's capable of paying and who's capable of providing product. And that's all that markets do. The objections come in from people who have other considerations than market values in mind and who feel as though expanding or extending markets into objectionable areas like human life, human death, the well-being of human beings is something that's potentially dangerous. Let me say a couple more things about that, and then I'm going to throw it open. This is a quick chapter, this fourth chapter. Throw it open for questions or comments before we move to chapter 5. Sandel talks about one other way that capitalist markets could potentially make the world more efficient, but in a way that comes at a cost, the cost of human relationship and human sentiment. And he calls it, on page 149, the terrorism futures market. Okay, gamblers tend to be very good at predictions. If you want to know who's going to win an election, don't look at the polls leading up to the election. Instead, look at the gambling websites, because the gamblers are actually much better than pollster numbers at predicting who is likely to win. Gamblers, though, are not just good at elections, they're also good at predicting the likely occurrence of certain phenomena. So, for instance, Sandel is considering this possibility. What about offloading intelligence gathering on the part of the government to gamblers on websites? Let me explain. So, the intelligence gathering business in the government, the CIA, the FBI, etc., is a very complex and inefficient process. And often it's shaped by the biases, conscious or unconscious, of the people who are involved. But markets are great at getting around people's personal biases. See, because markets are aggregates of a whole bunch of different opinions. A price point for a particular product is not just shaped by you and your choices. When you go and buy milk at the grocery store, the price point that you are paying, my wife recently complained because she's now having to pay over $3 a gallon at Aldi. And she said, don't believe them if they say inflation is not occurring. It certainly is. Okay, But the price point that you're paying when you buy milk at the grocery store is not just determined by you. Yes, you have a tiny little influence in shaping that price point based on whether you that day decide to purchase milk or not. If you do, that's likely to increase the price going forward. If you choose not to purchase milk and you say, well, I won't pay prices that high, then that will tend to drive the price down. Okay, but the price point is actually shaped by millions of other people, all of whom are milk purchasers at their grocery stores. And the fact that markets disperse information gathering and equip or empower each individual participant in the market to play a small role in shaping the price point of milk is usually seen as one of the great strengths of markets. Okay, because it gets around the personal bias problem. Individuals who have a particular opinion always have certain biases or certain assumptions that shape their view of the thing in question. Okay, and when FBI and CIA agents gather information about the world, it's always shaped by their own biases. So why not allow markets to solve this social coordination problem? Why not allow people, for instance, to bet in online gaming forums on where the next terrorist attack will be, okay, or what it will be, or solve some other intelligence problem that the government struggles with. Now, there could be abuses. We could imagine a terrorist deciding and planning on an attack and taking out a large position betting on himself prior to the attack. There could be abuses, but the overall benefits could be substantial, okay? Because a whole bunch of people with real money on the line, real skin in the game, would be motivated to seek out information about where the next terrorist attack is likely to occur, and thus could be more efficient, much more efficient, at gathering, sifting, and aggregating information than intelligence gathering services that the government employs currently. Of course, this kind of a thing, when it has been raised as a proposal, always meets with great opposition, because the idea of betting on people's lives in that way, how many people are going to die in the next terrorist attack, or whatever the particular wager is something that strikes a lot of non-market enthusiasts as being beyond the pale, and an expansion of capitalist markets into areas that render them immoral. Okay, but it is certainly an example of food for thought, and I personally agree with Sandel. I think it would be massively more efficient if market forces could be used to aggregate intelligence rather than government-equipped agents with their personal biases and their own political agendas and all that. But of course, it comes at the cost of us, the cynical cost of us betting on people's lives, like that would involve. Let me stop and ask if there are questions or comments about Sandel's remarks on capitalist markets and what that means for us in circumstances where life and death is on the line, or the application of capitalist-style thinking to issues of life and death. Any comments or reflections?
Yeah, I think...
Drew, go ahead.
Whenever you first started talking about it, I was like, man, that is dark, and I don't want to have anything to, deal with that. But whenever you started talking about, the benefits of it, I was like, oh, boy. That's, real incentive for people that have more knowledge than even, the CIA or whatever.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
To bet, and then that shows up as, this is a potential threat, or, this is a potential spot for national security, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
The incentives for people working in the CIA is that they have benefits. They get paid to do their jobs. So why not let people risk their own money and basically get paid to find these spots?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If they lose money because national security ends up locking that place down, making sure that it's not a threat anymore, it's you have people that are finding the weaknesses. I think that's pretty cool.
Markets are incredible at their ability to solve these kinds of problems. So I totally agree with what Drew was saying, right? So CIA agents get their paycheck every month, regardless. FBI agents the same. But if people have real skin in the game, where they're betting real money on certain important intelligence events, it's going to be worth their while to figure out whether they're going to be right or not. And if you think about, as an analogy, the sports world, no one knows better what the probabilities are of a certain sports team winning than the gamblers, the people who have real money on the line. And they have this down to a science. Boy, those guys can sift statistics and figure out who's pitching tonight and what the starting lineup is going to be and precisely what the batting averages are and all that. They have statistics and they are really good at figuring out probabilities. Now, of course, like you say, maybe if the government reacts to a market that says the next terrorist attack will occur in New York City and the government increases its patrols in New York City, maybe the gamblers would then react to that. Markets can shift like that. They can move quickly. And then they shift to the next city. Yeah, so if the government increases its forces in a certain location, the market participants can include that in their calculus of what events are likely to occur. This all comes at the cost, though, of betting on human life and death, and it feels icky to all of us.
I think if you put in the rules for the betting, you can put if there's a clear abuse of let's say you're betting on someone dying before this age, you put in $1 million the day before.
Right.
And they die of unnatural causes. Obviously, there's something going on there, and you can strike that person out and possibly go to jail for taking someone's life for money.
A capitalist forum could be used to hunt the terrorists down if they start betting on their own cause. It's like Pete Rose betting on his own game.
Yeah, it's like you can put rules in place where people aren't betting on people's lives being taken, but instead on the attack itself, where it's going to happen. I think that's more moral than betting on when someone's going to die.
Sure.
I mean, it may be more fun to bet on when people are going to die. For some people, not for me. I would not want to be a part of that. But for something like location, something happening.
Sure. These issues may seem abstract to us now, but actually the online gaming world is expanding very rapidly. And people are betting on all sorts of things these days, mostly because of the facilitation of gambling through the internet. So I wouldn't be surprised if we get an explosion of markets into non-sports related worlds before long and start seeing more efficiency solving social coordination mechanisms that are market-based like this. We'll see. It'll be interesting. Let's move to chapter 5. And I'm actually going to be letting you guys go a little bit early today, but I want to talk about the naming rights chapter first. Okay? In chapter 5, Sandel actually talks about sports, turns to sports, and the application of capitalist markets to the world of sports. I'm sure we've all noticed this recently, but have you noticed, those of you who are sports fans, that everything in sports these days seems to have a corporate sponsor? It's all over the place. Stadiums, heck, somebody's at bat can be sponsored. Somebody, this pass brought to you by AT&T. We hear things like that. The phenomenon of the corporate sponsor, in one sense, is a mutually advantageous application of capitalist markets because it benefits the teams and the stadium owners who get to sell naming rights to their stadiums. It benefits also the corporate sponsors who presumably wouldn't seek to sponsor particular stock cars, in NASCAR or stadiums or particular commercial breaks. This is commercial break brought to you by, if it didn't raise their profile. Okay, so it's mutually advantageous to the buyers and the sellers in a certain sense. Okay, and it's not just, of course, naming rights that's a phenomenon occurring in sports and that's emblematic of the expansion of capitalist markets into the world of sports. The sales of all sorts of things in sports have been exploding. Take luxury boxes as an example. Luxury boxes are out of reach for most of us, probably for the entirety of my lifetime. But luxury box purchases are really, really lucrative and bring great money to the owners of sports teams. I'm not sure how many luxury boxes are over there in NRG Stadium, but it's a lot, and it's very lucrative for those who want to sell those luxury boxes to potential buyers. And buyers presumably would not buy the luxury boxes if it weren't their while to do such things. Okay, Sandel says a lot of people, when they encounter this, especially if they themselves don't financially benefit from it, they rail against the commercialism. Okay, so let me just read off a little bit of these, some of these criticisms on page 185. Critics and activists talk about tawdry commercial values, the debastements of advertising and commercialism. They call commercialism a coarsening of the heart, mind, and the communities across the country. Some describe advertising, especially in sports, as a kind of pollution. I don't want my team or my stadium defiled with advertisements, is a common attitude. Why do people object then to the expansion of market norms into the world of sports if it's so beneficial in so many ways? In fact, actually, you think that tickets to see your favorite team are expensive. They'd be much more expensive if stadium and team owners didn't have other sources of income, namely corporate sponsorships that they could rely upon to supplement the costs of running their franchises and their stadiums. And yet, even in the face of that, people don't tend, ordinary people, non-market advocates, don't tend to be enthusiastic about the prospect of corporate sponsorship. Let me read two objections that are characteristically cited. This is on page 186. The first objection accepts the principle of freedom of choice, but questions whether every instance of market choice is truly voluntary. This is an objection that goes right to the heart of capitalist markets as a system of economic exchange, whether exchanges in capitalist markets are truly voluntary. For instance, if a homeowner facing imminent foreclosure agrees to have an advertisement painted on her house, her choice may not really be free, but may be effectively coerced. If a parent in desperate need of money to buy medicine for his child agrees to be tattooed to advertise a product, his choice may not be all that voluntary. The coercion objection maintains that market relations can be considered free only when the background conditions under which we buy and sell are fair, only when no one is coerced by dire economic necessity. Let's stop and consider the coercion objection for just a minute. Sandel raises it in the context of sports, but it could be talked about in the context of any exchanges in capitalist markets. The advocate of capitalist markets, let's say the advocate of unregulated markets, like a libertarian type, like Milton Friedman, for instance, the economist, very, very famous 20th century economist who we looked at the beginning of the semester. An advocate of capitalist markets would say all you need in order to have a free and fair transaction between different parties in a capitalist market is an absence of physical coercion and an absence of mental manipulation. So as long as nobody is, hypnotized, as long as nobody is being physically forced, then what you have is a free and fair transaction. Those tend to be conservative defenders of markets. Liberal critics of markets usually point to the soft coercive forces that can occur even when people formally are free and formally are not being physically or mentally coerced. The soft coercion can take the form usually of financial hardship. If someone is in financial hardship and is dealing with a counterparty who's much better off than they are, then that person is in an asymmetric power relationship with the counterparty. So the liberal critics would allege, at least. And in a circumstance like that, it's not truly a free transaction. It is a transaction that is coercive, at least to some extent. That sort of a consideration is one of the main motivations behind the rise of labor and unions. The idea being that workers are naturally in an asymmetric power relationship with their employers because they're just individual workers and can be replaced with other workers. But together, all the workers negotiating together in a union can be on equal footing with the employer and can exchange in the form of a work contract or something like that in a manner that is genuinely free and fair with an employer. We'll look at a second objection arising from Sandel's investigations in Chapter 5 in just a minute. But let's think for just a minute about this first objection. Can we have freedom of choice in capitalist markets in circumstances where there is asymmetry in the prosperity of the counterparties? Can transactions be free in circumstances where there is asymmetry in the prosperity of the counterparties? What do we think? Does everyone understand the question? Yeah, for sure. So, if I say to you, Isabella, do you want to buy this book from me for $11? And you say, no way. If you knock it down to 8, I'll think about it, but not a penny over that. We're in a pretty free and fair exchange, aren't we? Because the stakes aren't that high, and I'm not a whole lot better off than Isabella. She's a student, right? So I know she's not making a lot of money. But who knows? Maybe she's got secret money coming from her parents. No one ever, you never know where somebody's funding might come from. All right, but we are in kind of a transactional state of equals. If Ralph Lauren, the apparel company, goes to Honduras and builds a factory and negotiates with local workers to pay them, say, 40 cents an hour to make clothing, what you have arguably there is not a transaction of equals. There's an asymmetry in the prosperity of the counterparties. Ralph Lauren, the company, being very prosperous, the workers in the Honduran village being really unprosperous. So the question is, do capitalist markets, in order to be free and fair and thus presumably moral, do they require equal counterparties? Or are libertarian advocates of markets right when they say that you can have free and fair capitalist markets, in other words, moral capitalist markets, where the counterparties are asymmetric in their prosperity, but are not being coerced physically or mentally? What do we think? Does everyone now understand what's at stake?
I think it's kind of hard to not have the coercion.
Okay.
So it's like yeah, Ralph Lauren could choose to work in the United States and pay people minimum wage at a factory, or they can go to Honduras, build a factory there, and pay people what they're used to being paid there with better working conditions.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like it may seem in comparison to the United States, it's like yeah, that's not a free and fair transaction, but for the people in Honduras, they're like, I'd rather have this job than this other job, and it pays maybe even a bit more, and I don't have to scavenge for food because now I have at least some sort of income. So
The advocates of capitalist markets would say what you are looking at in that situation is a Honduran worker who is looking at his or her options and deciding what's best for him or her. And nobody is coercing him or her. Ralph Lauren is not coercing that person physically. Opponents or critics of market forces would say, Ralph Lauren is exploiting the worker because Ralph Lauren is taking advantage of the fact that the worker has very few other options. Thus, there is a power asymmetry or a prosperity asymmetry between the negotiating counterparties.
I think there's a fair argument on both sides. Yeah, I think there could be a better balance. So I think there's something more of like there's a reason why we have a minimum wage here, so that for the most part people aren't completely taken advantage of, but in a completely different state, I don't know, if there aren't laws protecting that, then if anything, the people that are getting all butthurt about it, I think they can stand up and fight for the rights of those people in that country rather than just fighting for Ralph Lauren
Okay.
not work in that country.
Okay.
So you can fight for someone's rights and not harm a company that's just using basically the most efficient way possible that they see.
Okay. Good comment.
Would it be taken advantage though if they were happy with what they're getting?
Good question. Can people be exploited if they do not themselves feel themselves to be exploited? What do you guys think? I like that question. I think that also gets to the heart of what we're talking about here. Suppose the Honduran workers don't feel themselves to be exploited. They've looked at their other options. Their other options are worse. So they're grateful for their job. Is it still exploitation if they don't feel themselves to be exploited? Can people be duped? Yes, almost certainly, right? People can be duped. But what if they strongly feel as though they are not being exploited?
Well, I think as long as they aren't being duped and like being told they're going to be paid this amount, they're going to get so-and-so benefits, as long as they're getting exactly what they're being promised, I don't think that's exploitation. I think if they're given a better opportunity and they choose to take it, that's within their free will, and that's, I think, on their side, that's a free and fair transaction. I think on Ralph Lauren's side, they're taking the best possible opportunity that they can take.
Okay, all right. And that's a very powerful, classic, conservative defensive markets. Okay, it's well stated. Right, anybody else? Can workers be deceived about the freedom or fairness of their transactions? Can capitalist markets be immoral, even if the participants in them are, formally speaking, free, that is not physically or mentally coerced?
The thing is though, is like, you're, I guess, exploiting them and taking advantage of them a little bit, but it's just kind of because they don't know. But I feel like if they would understand what an American worker would make, and they would switch their price and things. Right.
Okay, so they can be duped then. They can be duped and be exploited but not realize it.
I think in response to that, I was thinking that same thing. And that is very much a comparison of the American worker versus the Honduran worker. You have, if the Honduran lived in the United States, yeah, I think that would be utter garbage. Like, you should not be paid that little because living expenses, you have to have some sort of like,
Even adjusted for living expenses, if I may, and then I'll
Yeah.
let you finish. Even adjusted for living expenses, the Honduran workers 40 cents an hour is substantially below the American minimum wage workers $7.50 an hour. Like, it's way lower, even adjusted for living expenses.
then I
But
would say
go ahead.
I would say that is in some senses, yeah, that's a sense like exploitation. And
Okay,
I think-
so you would say that's exploitation just because of the degree of
yeah, if
the,
Ralph Lauren knows
the minimal payments.
what they're paying, at least workers that work at one of their stores here in America, who does significantly less work than a Honduran worker, then they're exploiting the Honduran workers in comparison because they're paying someone less than what they should be paid in, like, with what their living expenses are.
Okay, all right. A conservative counterpart, an advocate of markets, would push back against both of you guys and say, no, no, no. The worker is choosing freely.
Yep.
The worker is choosing freely. And the fact that the worker is choosing freely means that this is a free, fair, and just capitalist market transaction. Okay, I'm gonna leave it at that, because I actually agree with both of you. I agree that there is exploitation that's going on because of the power and prosperity asymmetries, and people can be duped. But there is a powerful conservative rejoinder to that, that as long as people are formally free, then there is no exploitation. Let me mention one last thing in this chapter, and then I'm going to let you guys go a little bit early. Okay, Sandel writes at the bottom of 186, referring to a previous section, he says, neither of these positions helps us explain what's troubling about a world in which market thinking and market relationships invade every human activity. To describe what's disquieting about market thinking invading every human activity, we need the moral vocabulary of corruption and degradation. Okay, consider the language employed by the critics of commercialism. And he's referring especially to the critics of commercialism in baseball or basketball or football. They call it debasement, defilement, coarsening, pollution, the loss of the sacred. You know, is not. Oh, they've renamed the advertising break is nothing sacred. Okay. With naming rights and advertising, the corruption can play out on two levels. In some cases, the commercialization of a practice is degrading in itself. So, for example, walking around with a corporate-sponsored tattoo ad on one's forehead is demeaning, even if the choice to sell was freely made. Okay, and then there is another instance where advertising is not corrupting in itself, but may contribute nonetheless, this is on page 188, to the commercialization of social life as a whole. Okay, I think the main point that Sandel's getting at here is that there's a kind of a coarsening that comes with the commercialization of everything. No single participant, no single advertiser or capitalist participant is responsible for all of it. But when everything has a corporate sponsor, I mean, just to make the point clear, we could go beyond sports, beyond the sports world. Imagine like your church having a corporate sponsor, right? You know, this sacrament, this Lord's Supper brought to you by, and then you list the corporate sponsor, right? You can see the expansion of the corruption when we look at something that people consider even more important or valuable than sports. Okay, and the criticism is just that no single advertiser in providing corporate sponsorship is responsible for the debasement or defiling or corruption of life, but altogether, when a whole bunch of them do it, there's a kind of a coarsening experience that takes place. Okay, this American presidency, sponsored by Tesla or something like that. Actually, that's not far off when it comes to politicians and political donations for corporate sponsors. Okay, any questions or comments about any of those things that we've said today? Let me say a couple summary things, and then I'll let you guys go. This has been a fast-paced course where we have looked at a bunch of different topics in business ethics. We started by looking at the purpose of business and your purpose in business. That is, we looked at individual purposes in business, and we looked also at the purpose of the corporation as a whole. We then moved to a module where we talked about the relationship between Christianity and business. And I argued that you can be a Christian in a capitalist enterprise, although capitalism itself is not necessarily a Christian system. The way you can be a conscientious Christian in a capitalist system is by thinking not just of your own interests, which is what the system tries to force you to think about, and rightly so for good reasons. Okay, you think not only about your own interests, but also about the interests of others. A good conscientious Christian participant in a capitalist system should think about the interests of customers, the interests of counterparties, the interests of suppliers, and in that way live out his or her faith in a manner that is consistent with biblical teachings about how we should operate as Christians. We then looked at a series of submodules on particular topics in subfields of business. management ethics, for instance, where we talked about HR dynamics, we talked about supply chain ethics. We looked at finance ethics, we looked at accounting ethics, the morality of different dynamics in accounting, balance sheets, corruption in fudging data, etc. We looked at marketing ethics. And then we looked over the last 2 weeks at 2 special purpose topics, 3 weeks. We looked at business and the environment, and we looked also at this general overview of capitalist markets and their moral strengths and weaknesses in the context of this Sandel text. Okay, I have learned a lot with you guys this semester. Let's face it, this has been a very challenging semester and a very challenging school year. Thank you for persevering through it to the end. We have a little bit further to go. If you have any questions about the final exam, the fastest way to reach me with them is by email. Okay, and other than that, this will be the last time I'm going to get to see you guys until the fall. So I'm going to say a quick prayer for us and then dismiss us. And if you have any questions, see me after class or email me. Okay, let me say a quick prayer for us. Gracious God, I thank you for these students. I thank you for all that they've meant to me this semester. I thank you for strengthening them to persevere thus far. I pray for your blessing on them over the next week or so as they complete their projects, their papers, and their tests. I pray that you would give them strength, wisdom, discipline, and insight to do their very best on these assignments. And then I pray that you would give them rest this summer so that they can recuperate from the grueling semester and really whole school year that we've experienced. Thank you for bringing us this far this semester, and we pray for your traveling mercies now to go a little bit further and to do so successfully. Amen. All right, thank you all for a wonderful semester. You guys go in peace.